What would you do if the person you loved most started putting everyone else before you, even your unborn child? This isn't just a breakup story. It's a journey of heartbreak realization, and one woman's decision to choose herself and her baby over a man who never truly showed up. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. I still remember the first time I met Evan. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, the kind of charm that wasn't forced, but quiet and steady. We met at a mutual friend's party, and within an hour, I felt like I'd known him for years. He listened when I spoke. Not just nodded, but truly listened. Back then, that alone felt rare enough to hold on to. For the first few years, he made me feel like I mattered more than anything else in his world. He'd surprise me with little things. My favorite takeout after a long shift. Sticky notes with silly doodles, flowers, just because it was a Tuesday. He encouraged my dreams, even the ones that didn't make much sense. He was the kind of partner I'd always hoped to find thoughtful, funny present, or so I believed. Looking back now, I realized that version of Evan was real, but only in short bursts, and usually when life was easy, when stress crept in, or things got inconvenient. That attentive side of him would slowly fade, like fog lifting to reveal something colder underneath. It didn't happen overnight. That's the hardest part to explain. It was a slow erosion. A shift, so subtle that I didn't recognize it until I was standing knee-deep in disappointment, wondering how I got there. It started with his friends. Evan had a close-knit group of friends from high school. That in itself wasn't the problem. I actually liked them. At first they were loud, a little immature, but funny and loyal. The problem was, Evan never really grew out of that phase with them. They were still his number one priority, even after we moved in together, even after we got married. If they called, he answered. If they wanted to hang out, he dropped everything, including me. There were dinners. I cooked where he never showed. Weekend getaways. He backed out of last minute. Birthday plans. That has somehow slipped his mind, because the guys had a sudden gaming night he just couldn't miss. At first I told myself it was temporary, that he'd adjust, that it wasn't a big deal. But when it became a pattern, when every important moment in our life was sidelined for someone else, I started to realize I wasn't his home base. I was a pit stop between social obligations. Then came the bigger cracks, the ones no amount of justifying could fix. His mother, for instance, made it clear from the beginning that she didn't think I was good enough. It wasn't even subtle. At our engagement party, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not quite what I pictured for Evan, but I guess time changes expectations." I remember waiting, hoping for Evan to defend me. Instead, he laughed. Not nervously, not out of discomfort. He laughed like it was funny. That moment still sits with me, not because of what she said, but because he did nothing. He let it happen over and over again. At our wedding, she picked a fight over something as small as the seating chart. During family holidays, she'd make snide remarks about my career or how I dressed, and each time Evan either brushed it off, or worse, took her side, and I began to feel like a guest in his family, not a partner building one of our own. Still, I stayed, because that's what you do, right? You love someone, you work through it. You tell yourself that loyalty means staying even when it's hard, even when you're slowly disappearing inside the relationship. I kept waiting for the man I fell in love with to come back, the version of him who left sweet notes and wanted to hear every detail of my day. But as months passed, that man became a memory replaced by someone increasingly distant physically, there, emotionally checked out. And then I got pregnant. When I found out, I was terrified, excited, but terrified. It wasn't planned, but it also didn't feel like a mistake. I thought maybe, just maybe this would be the thing that pulled us closer again. That Evan would show up like he used to. That becoming parents would light something new in us. At first he smiled when I told him, but it was small, almost uncertain. I chalked it up to shock. Weeks passed, and his disinterest grew louder. I'd talk about baby names, nursery colors, prenatal appointments, and he'd nod along, eyes flicking back to his phone, or the game on TV. He didn't come to the first ultrasound. Said he had something with the guys, and promised to come to the next one. He didn't. Each time I brought up the baby, I felt like I was nagging, like I was forcing him to care. Deep down, I started to understand something I didn't want to admit. Evan didn't want this life. Not with me. Not really. But I still wasn't ready to give up, not yet, I thought. Maybe if we talked, really talked, it would help. So one night I asked him, point blank, "Are you happy? Do you even want to be a father?" He didn't answer at first. He looked away, ran a hand through his hair, and then said, "I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of responsibility. I feel like you just dropped this on me." It wasn't a drop. It was life, our life unfolding, and he couldn't even meet it halfway. But the worst part, he told me he'd already spoken to his friends about it, that they understood him, and thought he was just being honest. Like their opinions mattered more than mine, more than our child. That's when the truth finally landed sharp and painful. I had spent years fighting for a spot in a life where I was never the priority, a life where my presence was tolerated, not treasured, where I gave and gave until there was almost nothing left of me, and he still chose everyone else. The final straw came days later, when I had a minor pregnancy scare, just a sharp pain enough to send me to the doctor, to be safe. I called him. He didn't answer. Texted. No reply. Hours later he messaged, "Sorry. I was in the middle of a campaign with the guys." Everything okay? That night, as I sat alone in a friend's car, after the appointment, one hand resting on my stomach, I felt something shift in me, a kind of clarity I'd never had before. This man wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to suddenly become reliable, or present, or kind. And I couldn't raise a child in a home where love felt like a competition I'd already lost. I went home, packed my things quietly, and left. I wish I could say leaving felt empowering, that I walked out of that house with my head high and a fire in my chest. But the truth is, I cried the entire drive to my friend's apartment ugly, gut-deep sobs that shook my body and made it hard to breathe. Not because I regretted leaving, but because admitting that I had to meant accepting just how much I had lost along the way. For 8 years, Evan was my person, my home, my future, the name. I thought I'd grow old beside. I had imagined holidays with our children, road trips, late-night talks when we were gray and wrinkled. Leaving wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the death of a story I had written in my heart. And still, it was the right thing to do. When I arrived at my friend Jenna's place, she didn't ask questions. She just opened the door, pulled me into a hug, and whispered, "I've got you." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that, until I felt my knees start to give out. The first night was a blur of tissues and silence. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to think. I sat on her couch, one hand on my belly, trying to make sense of what came next. The quiet was deafening, and for a moment I considered calling Evan, just to hear his voice, just to pretend things were normal, but I didn't, because normal had become something I couldn't live with anymore. The next few days were a mix of survival and small victories. I found a lawyer. I started the paperwork I called my job, and told them I needed some time. I told as few people as possible, because every time I had to say the words, I left him. It made everything feel more real. Jenna helped me find a therapist. That first session, I couldn't even finish a sentence without crying. I felt like a failure. Not just as a wife, but as a soon-to-be mother. I kept thinking, how can I raise a child when I couldn't even keep my marriage together? But my therapist said something that stuck with me. Leaving isn't failing. Staying in something that's breaking you, that's the real loss. Slowly, I started to believe her. Still, the loneliness was brutal. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake with my hand on my growing belly, whispering promises to a baby who wasn't even here yet. I'm sorry. I hope you'll understand. One day, I did this for you. There was guilt, too. Deep, clawing guilt. I worried that my baby would grow up without a father. I worried that Evan would turn things around, and I'd be the villain for walking away. I worried about money, space, the birth, everything, but more than anything, I grieved the life I thought I was building. Then came the message. A few days after I filed it in, Evan texted me. Just 2 words. You serious? That was it. No apology. No concern. No. Are you okay? Just disbelief that I had actually followed through. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Because if I opened that door even a crack, I knew he'd find a way to pull me back in. And I couldn't afford to go back. Not for me, and not for the child growing inside me, who deserved a better version of love than what we had. Still, the silence that followed was almost worse. Weeks passed. My belly grew. I started sorting out baby things, second-hand clothes from friends, a borrowed crib. I went to doctor's appointments alone. I cried in waiting rooms, but somewhere in the mess of it all, something started to shift. I began to breathe easier. One morning, I felt the baby kick for the first time. It was small, just a flutter, but it was enough to make me pause, smile, and think, this is real. We're doing this. That kick, as simple as it was, changed something in me for the first time in months. I didn't feel powerless. I felt connected. I felt like a mother. Jenna threw me a small baby shower in her living room, just a few close friends, some laughter, cheap decorations from the dollar store. But it was more love than I'd felt in years. They didn't ask why I left. They just showed up with casseroles, diapers, and stories about sleepless nights, and tiny fingers. That day, I laughed harder than I had in a long time. And when everyone left, I sat on the couch and cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Gratitude that I had chosen something better, something real. Of course, it wasn't all healing and hope. There were still days I missed him, or rather, the idea of him, the version of Evan I fell in love with, the one who used to leave sticky notes and kiss my forehead before bed. But grief is like that. It makes you miss people who no longer exist. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering what he was doing, if he ever thought about me, if he missed our baby already. But then I'd remember how absent he was even when we were together, how I sat alone at doctor's appointments while he played video games with his friends, and I'd remind myself, I didn't walk away from a man who loved me. I walked away from a man who never chose me. By the time my due date came close, I had moved into a small studio apartment Jenna helped me find. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom space with a leaky faucet and nosy neighbors. But it was mine. Ours. A fresh start. I painted the nursery corner, a soft sage green. Hung up hand-me-down baby clothes. Bought a second-hand rocking chair. Every little detail was a promise to my child. I will always show up for you. And then one late night, as rain tapped against the window, my water broke. Jenna rushed me to the hospital. I clutched her hand. Through the contractions, sweat and fear, and adrenaline pouring through me. I had never been more scared or more determined. Hours later, when they placed that tiny human on my chest, wrinkled, crying perfect, I felt everything all at once. Love, relief, terror, wonder. I looked down at my baby tears, streaming down my face, and whispered, "We made it. You're safe. We're okay," and I meant it. Evan never showed up. He knew my due date. He had my number, but he didn't call. Didn't check in. Not even a single word. And oddly enough, that silence was its own kind of closure. The days after the birth were a blur of soft cries, sleepless nights, and quiet awe. I named him Noah. He had my nose and his father's dimples, though I tried not to think about that part too much. Every time I looked at his little face, I felt this overwhelming mix of emotions, love so deep. It almost hurt, and a strange hollow ache, where Evan's presence should have been. There was no call, no text, no flowers, no congratulations, nothing. At first, I kept checking my phone, half expecting some sort of message. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he'd come around. I told myself that every few hours, until days turned into weeks. And all I got was silence. That kind of silence isn't neutral. It screams. It tells you exactly where you stand. It says, "You're on your own now." And the thing is, being a single mom wasn't something I had prepared for. Not emotionally, not financially, and certainly not logistically. Every feed, every diaper change, every bath. I did it all alone. My back hurt from rocking Noah to sleep. My mind was foggy from the constant bone-deep exhaustion. There were moments especially, around 3 a.m. when I'd hold him close and whisper, "I don't know what I'm doing." But somehow, I kept doing it. Jenna was a godsend, picking up groceries, holding Noah so I could shower, texting me at odd hours, just to ask, "Did you eat today?" My parents helped too, even though they lived across the state. They visited when they could, but most days it was just me and Noah against the world. And honestly, some days I felt stronger than I ever thought I could, but other days, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of unmet needs. The bitterness started to creep in quietly. It wasn't just that Evan had disappeared. It was that he had chosen to. This wasn't some tragic accident, or a life taken too soon. This was a conscious decision to abandon the life we had made together. And the more time passed, the more I wondered, was he ever really planning to show up? Or had I just been clinging to a fantasy all along? I thought about sending him pictures of Noah. Updates. A part of me even thought it would be the right thing to do. After all, wasn't he still Noah's father? Didn't he deserve to know his son? But then, I remembered all the times he had been absent before the birth, during the pregnancy, even when my health was in question. I remembered begging for his attention while he played games with his friends. I remembered him choosing silence when our life needed his voice, and I realized just because someone shares your blood doesn't mean they've earned a place in your life. Still, the world around me didn't always see it that way. People asked questions, coworkers, acquaintances, even well-meaning strangers. "Oh, is your husband working late? Is Dad watching the baby tonight?" I smiled politely, or changed the subject, but inside each was a reminder of the empty space Evan had left behind. One afternoon, while waiting in line at the pharmacy, a woman looked at Noah and said, "He's adorable. His dad must be so proud." I felt my stomach twist. I nodded politely. But that night, I cried. Because even though I had done everything on my own, even though I knew I was enough, there was still a tiny part of me that mourned what could have been not for me, but for Noah. He deserved a father who showed up, who held him during midnight feedings, who counted his tiny fingers and whispered promises to protect him. And Evan hadn't even asked if he was healthy. Around Noah's 6-week checkup, something shifted in me again. I stopped waiting, stopped wondering, stopped making excuses for a man who had already made his choice. I began to focus on what I did have. I had a son who smiled in his sleep and wrapped his fingers around mine, like he never wanted to let go. I had friends who showed up, family, who supported me, and strength I never knew I possessed. I started going for walks with Noah in the mornings. There was a small park nearby, and it became our little sanctuary. Birds chirping, wind in the trees, stroller wheels bumping along the path. It was quiet, but not lonely. It was ours. Sometimes I'd sit on a bench watching other parents play with their kids and feel a pang in my chest, but it wasn't pain anymore. Not really. It was more like a scar, a reminder of something that hurt deeply. Once, but had since healed enough not to bleed. One chilly afternoon, I found an old photo of Evan and me in a book I hadn't touched in years. We were laughing, arms wrapped around each other, back when things still felt easy. I stared at it for a while, and then I slipped it into a drawer, shut it, and didn't look back. Because that wasn't my life anymore. And no matter how golden the memories, they weren't worth trading for the peace I was slowly building now. I used to think being strong meant holding on. Now, I know it's about knowing when to let go. Letting go of who Evan used to be, of who I used to be with him, of the life I thought we'd build. And most of all, letting go of the lie that I needed him to be whole. Noah was growing fast, his eyes tracking my every move. His giggles starting to fill the tiny apartment like music. Every little milestone was a reminder we were moving forward together. And Evan, he remained silent. No messages, no letters, not even a whisper of curiosity about the life he had walked away from. And as hard as it was to accept, it made things simpler. His absence became the closure I never thought I'd get. Not loud, not dramatic, just an empty seat that stopped waiting to be filled. It had been nearly 3 months since Noah was born. By then the fog of the early newborn stage had begun to lift. The cries were a little less constant, the nights slightly more manageable. I'd even learned how to drink lukewarm coffee with pride. My days had rhythm. Diaper nap, bottle, giggle, repeat. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And then, just when I thought the storm had passed, my past came knocking. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had just gotten Noah down for a nap and was folding laundry when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Evan. It wasn't a new number. It was the same contact I had stopped looking at months ago, the one I almost deleted a dozen times. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, heart pounding, unsure whether to pick up or throw the phone across the room. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey," he said, like it hadn't been nearly a year of silence. Like he hadn't missed the birth of his own son. I was hoping we could talk. I didn't respond. Couldn't. My mouth was dry. "I heard from a friend that you had the baby," he continued. "I know I should have reached out sooner, but I didn't know what to say. I wanted to laugh." "You didn't know what to say, so you said nothing for 9 months. Instead, I stayed quiet." He sighed. "Look, I've made a lot of mistakes. I know that. But I want to see him. My son. I think I deserve that." That word deserve set something off in me. He deserved to see the child he ignored. He deserved to walk back in like he hadn't missed everything. The ultrasounds, the kicks, the hospital, the tears, the long nights, the first smiles. He deserved that. I hung up, my hands were shaking. I paced the living room for what felt like hours. Every emotion I thought I had buried came crashing back. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. The audacity of it all. To vanish and return only when it was convenient. But Evan wasn't done. The next day I got an email, then a message from a mutual friend, then eventually a formal letter from his attorney. He was filing for visitation rights. I sat on the floor of my apartment, letter in hand, heart pounding. I stared at Noah playing with a soft rattle, clueless about the storm that was now circling our little world. I wanted to scream, not because I was afraid of sharing my son, but because I didn't trust the man who wanted to claim him. Evan hadn't changed. He hadn't reached out of love. It was guilt, or pride, or pressure from someone else. Maybe even the image he wanted to protect. But it wasn't about Noah. It never had been. Still the law, didn't care about feelings, and suddenly I was being forced to defend the life I had rebuilt. From the ashes, I hired a lawyer. She was sharp, compassionate, and didn't sugarcoat anything. "This won't be easy," she told me, "but you've done the hard part already, raising him alone." Court hearings were scheduled, custody evaluations, paperwork, background checks. My once quiet days became filled with phone calls and meetings, my anxiety rising with every step. I hated that Evan now had a say, that after months of silence, his name was suddenly part of every conversation again, that I had to prove myself as a mother when I'd already done everything without him. But in the middle of all the chaos, something shifted in me. I stopped being scared. Not because I trusted the system, and certainly not because I trusted Evan, but because I had truth on my side. I had proof. Late-night feedings, doctor's visits, diaper bags, and lullabies, and scraped knees, and whispered lullabies. I had lived every moment with Noah, loved him fully, with every fiber of my being, and Evan. He had a signature on a birth certificate he wasn't even present to sign. During our first mediation meeting, I saw him across the table. He looked tired, older, unsure of himself. Not the confident man I once married, but also not the father my son deserved. He talked about wanting to be part of Noah's life, about how he made mistakes, but was ready to do better. I asked him, "Why now?" He didn't answer. I pressed, "Why didn't you call when he was born, or when I was in the hospital, or the hundreds of times I cried, wondering how I'd do this alone?" Still no answer. The mediator shifted awkwardly. My lawyer gave me a nod to stop, but I needed to say it for me. "You didn't lose the right to be a father because of one mistake. You lost it because of 1,000 little choices. Every time you didn't show up. Every time you prioritized your ego." over our family. And now you think love is something you can file for like paperwork." He looked down. For the first time, I saw something like shame in his eyes. The legal process dragged on, but eventually limited visitation was granted, supervised and infrequent. Starting slow, I wasn't thrilled. But I agreed. Not for Evan, but for Noah. Because one day, he'll ask questions. And I want to be able to look him in the eye and say I did everything I could to protect you and give you the full truth. The first time Evan held Noah, I watched from across the room. Noah didn't cry, but he didn't smile. Either he looked at him with those wide, curious eyes, the same way he looked at the mailman, or a stranger. At the park. That moment shattered something in Evan. I think he expected magic, connection, redemption. But what he got was reality. Because fatherhood isn't about blood or biology. It's about showing up every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And Evan. He was still just learning what that meant, the weeks that followed. Evan's first supervised visit felt strange. Not chaotic, not dramatic. Just oddly quiet. Like the tension had finally started to settle, but something was still shifting beneath the surface. He came to the scheduled visits on time. Polite. Trying. He brought books. Diapers. Once, even a little stuffed lion. He looked nervous, holding Noah like a kid, cradling something too delicate to trust his own hands with. Noah stared at him curiously, but didn't reach for him. No instant bond. No warm father-son moment, and honestly, that was okay. Because real relationships aren't built in a single visit, or even a handful. They're built in the mundane, the sleepless, the inconvenient. And Evan had missed all of that. What he was doing now wasn't parenting. It was auditioning. The surprising thing was, I no longer felt angry. I watched Evan closely, not for signs of change, but for signs of truth. And while he said all the right things, I couldn't shake the sense that he was still playing catch-up with a life he thought would wait for him. It hadn't. We hadn't one afternoon after a visit. He asked if we could talk alone. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat on a bench outside the supervised visitation center. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. For a while, we didn't speak. Finally, he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to be a better father. I'm trying." I looked at him. Really looked. He was thinner, quieter, a little more human than the Evan I once knew. Still full of flaws, but maybe finally aware of them. I believe people can change. I said, but change isn't about proving something to others. It's about who you are when no one's watching. He nodded slowly. I missed everything, yes. I said you did. We didn't cry. We didn't hug. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Just two people sitting in the wreckage of what could have been trying to make peace with what was after that day. Evan became more consistent. He didn't try to overcompensate. He didn't force affection. He just showed up, quietly, slowly, and I let him. Not because I needed him, but because Noah might. And that was the biggest shift of all. I had spent so long carrying the weight of it all. Hurt, anger, loneliness, fear, but little by little, I began to set it down. Not because Evan made it right, but because holding it was no longer serving me. Motherhood had changed me. Not in the way movies show you, where everything becomes soft focus, and suddenly the world makes sense. No, it changed me in ways I hadn't expected. It made me sharper, more aware. It taught me to trust my gut and guard my peace. It taught me that love isn't about sacrifice at all costs. It's about boundaries, about self-respect, about saying, this is what I will allow in my life, and this is what I won't. Somewhere between the midnight feeds and court dates, I found a new version of myself. One who didn't settle for crumbs. One who stopped apologizing for leaving someone who never truly chose her. I used to think I needed closure. That one final conversation. One apology. One breakdown in tears that would somehow make it all make sense. But closure isn't always a clean-cut ending. Sometimes closure is waking up one morning and realizing you're not waiting anymore. You're not hoping he'll change. You're not wondering what could have been. You're just living, peacefully present. One evening, months after Evan's reappearance, I stood in the kitchen with Noah on my hip, making dinner while he babbled nonsense into my ear. Music played softly in the background, some old 70s soul tune my dad used to love. The window was cracked open, sledding in the scent of warm summer air and distant barbecue smoke. And I felt it. That strange, quiet joy that comes when you've made it through the fire and found something beautiful on the other side. Not perfect, not what you planned, but yours, my son, my peace, my strength. I wouldn't change any of it. Not because it was easy, but because it taught me everything I didn't know. I needed to learn. Would I ever trust Evan fully again? Probably not. Would I let Noah form his own opinion of him without my pain coloring the view? Absolutely. Because that's what healing is. Not pretending it didn't hurt, but choosing not to let that hurt control the story moving forward now. When people ask about my life, I don't flinch. I say, it's just me and my boy. We're figuring it out. And you know what? That's more than enough. Maybe you've been there too. Holding on to a version of someone you once loved, hoping they'll become the person you needed them to be. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to stay. It's to walk away, to rebuild, to choose yourself. So one day your child will know how to choose themselves too. If this story touched you, share it. You never know who might need to hear that it's okay to start over. Did this story make you see a part of yourself? If it did, don't forget to leave a comment to share your thoughts. And most importantly, subscribe to Family Story, my husband, so you can hear more heartfelt family stories every week. Marriage isn't just a journey, it's a long story. And you are our companion on every page.